Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing ghost stories and hauntings. Let's get into it. Story 1. I had an interest in unexplained phenomena by the age of 9 and loved to listen to my parents read ghost stories, or hear ghost stories around the campfire at Girl Scouts, but did not think that I would ever see a real ghost myself. One evening that would change. I was 11 years old and living in my parents' home in the Brookside neighborhood in Kansas City, Missouri. Brookside is an old neighborhood with large craftsman-style homes, and I'm sure there are many spirits roaming around there, but on this night, it would be a relative that I would see. After a Saturday evening at home, having dinner with the family and playing Monopoly, my younger sister and I headed to bed in our shared room upstairs. Her bed was across the room from mine. It was dark that night with a bit of moonlight coming in through the windows. We were a little bit wound up and were just talking softly when suddenly a mist began to form about 6 feet in the air just beyond the foot of my bed. I just quietly watched it form into a head of a man with clear features. It had a narrow nose, high forehead, and piercing eyes which seemed to stare right through me. I kept my composure, curious about what this was that I was looking at, when the head began to talk. I could not hear anything, but could clearly see words being formed by the mouth. It was speaking to me. At this point, I needed confirmation and asked my sister, "Do you see that thing floating at the foot of my bed?" My sister opened her eyes and looked to see the same thing, only being a bit more fragile than me, she screamed. Then I screamed. My father and brother ran up the stairs, flipped on the light, and Dad said angrily, "What is wrong?" The head disappeared when the light went on. I did not know if I should be scared or disappointed that it was gone. We explained what happened, and my father asked me what the apparition looked like, then went downstairs to get a photo album that I had never seen before. He asked me to look through it and see if anyone in it looked like the head of the person I saw. Sure enough, after browsing through, I stopped at the picture and said, "That is him." It turned out that it was my father's father, who died in 1950, 6 years before I was born. That was my in-your-face introduction to the spirit world. I've had many encounters with ghosts since then, but I will never forget the first. Story 2. I live in the city in an old Queen Anne-style house that is quite large, built in 1902. There is a staircase in the back near the kitchen that I believe the servants use that go up to the 3rd floor. The front staircase just goes to the 2nd floor. Approximately 3 years ago, as I was walking down the back staircase, right in front of my eyes was an animal that was huge, totally black, sleek with a long tail. Just its body alone filled up the doorway that leads into the kitchen, and the doorway was wide. At first, I thought that a stray dog had come into our house and felt a jolt of panic. We had 4 dogs at the time. I could not see the head of this animal, as its head was already past the door frame. I then realized it was not a dog, but a large cat. It walked so gracefully, yet there was an extreme power emanating from this animal. I could see the shiny fur and that long tail as it walked past the door into the dining room. As I looked around the corner, it was gone. I went into freak-out mode, running throughout the whole house looking for it. It was gone. I have not seen it since. I've been researching all this time trying to figure out why it showed itself to me. My astral sign is Aries. My spirit animals are hawk, tiger, and jaguar. So I don't know if this was a panther or a jaguar spirit. I did not feel afraid of it when I saw it, just awestruck. It was solid black and had no spots on it that I could see. It was not see-through, but solid black. If you have any ideas, please let me know. I still haven't figured this out. Story 3. The year was 1999, and my ex-husband and I were living in Missouri then. My boys were just babies, 3 and 1. We had found a charming old farmhouse in the country, and the rent was very affordable. It was a 2-bedroom home that was situated at the top of a hill, and you had to drive up a long gravel driveway to get on it. On the property were several old farm buildings. One could tell that in its day it was top of the line. I assumed by the metal awnings over the windows that it was a thriving farm in the 1940s or 50s, but we fell in love with it and settled right in. We didn't live there long. If I had to guess, probably no more than 5 or 6 months. In the beginning, nothing seemed out of place, and we were quite happy there. although at night I would go and sit in the screened-in sun porch that overlooked the old buildings and always felt like I was being watched. You could always hear noises coming from the property at night, but that's to be expected. Needless to say, I would make my smoking trips limited. We had moved in around May or June, and Halloween was just around the corner. My ex-husband and I were out in the yard with the kids, looking at the old original well that had been sealed shut and wondered why they quit using it. The owners had dug a new well and put a well house around it. I don't remember why we ended up standing in the well house, but there we were looking down into the well. I made a comment on how creepy it was and wondered how deep it went. As we're looking down into this black hole, my ex-husband says, "Wait a minute, I think I see something." With that, he climbs in just a little, and then after a few minutes comes back out with something wooden. He hands it to me and I look it over. It's a tombstone. Because it was near Halloween, I assumed that one of the previous occupants had made a Halloween decoration. I decided it would be perfect out in the front yard and leaned it up against the fence, not giving it another thought. That is when it began. I had noticed our oldest boy, who was 3 at the time, start to detach from his brother. I would find him in different parts of the house playing by himself and talking to someone. I kind of wondered why he had quit playing with his brother, but didn't think too much about it. This went on for a little over a week's time. One afternoon, it was lunchtime, and I had called him into the kitchen to eat. He came in and engaged in full conversation with no one. I asked him who he was talking to. Now, mind you, he was 3, and his vocabulary was limited. He answers, "My friend." I say, "Oh, that's nice, buddy. Is your friend nice?" And he replies with a nod. More curious, I ask, "What does he look like?" He then shrugs his shoulders and says he has no head. I will admit that I was caught off guard by this. Following this conversation, I wouldn't allow him to play alone anymore, and he had quit talking to his imaginary friend during the day, and once again would play with his brother. It went on like that for the next 2 or 3 days, and I thought that perhaps whatever was going on had passed. That is until I woke up in the middle of the night to him, the 3-year-old, crying and shaking me. I assumed he had a bad dream and carried him back to bed. When I would put him back in the bed, he would just sit up and tell me he didn't want me to leave. I would sing him some songs and reassure him that it was only a dream. He would eventually lay back down and go to sleep. This had become a nightly ritual for about a week. During this week in the day, I decided to play a game of hide and seek with my boys, as we did all the time. I stood in the hallway and counted to 10. In this hallway, there was an odd cupboard that was the length of the hallway, but only about 3 feet in height. As I was counting to 10, I hear this cupboard door open, and I naturally think that the boys had chosen to hide there. So after reaching 10, I called out, "Ready or not, here I come," and start heading towards this cupboard, which I noticed one of the doors was cracked open. Completely convinced that my kid was hiding in there, I tiptoe to it and swing open the doors with a boo. To my surprise, there was no one there. I found it a bit odd, but that is all. When I found the boys, they had been hiding in the back of the house in the laundry room. That night, I awoke to my oldest boy screaming in his room. I rushed down the hall and into his room to find him sitting up in his bed shaking and crying. He seemed very upset. I asked him if he'd had a bad dream, and he tells me no. I then ask him, why is he crying? He then points to a set of cupboards in his room. These cupboards were all the way up on the wall, but near the bottom, where one oddly sized cupboard was pretty small, maybe big enough to fit a couple of shoe boxes. The door was open and he was pointing at it, so I walk over and shut it. He still just sits there staring at it and crying. I ask him what's wrong with the cupboard. He tells me that's where his friend stays. I tell him that would be impossible since the cupboard was so small. He tells me his friend won't leave him alone. I ask him what does his friend want. What he said next sent chills down my spine. He tells me that his friend was searching for something. I ask him what his friend was searching for. He tells me his head. This was pretty unsettling for me to think that my son was being trolled by such a thing at such a young age. I decided to become kind of aggressive with this friend and asked my son what his friend's name was. He says George. So out loud in a very confrontational voice I say, "Okay, George, I know you want to find your head, but my son is only 3 and needs sleep. He cannot help you find it, and you need to leave him alone, or you'll have to deal with me." My son kind of laughed. I guess he thought it was funny watching his mom yelling like that. I tucked him in and told him that if George tried to bother him again, to tell him to leave him alone, which proved to be ineffective. The nights to follow, I would wake up to my son screaming in his room. Only this time, when I would enter his room, he had hid under his bed. He would not open his eyes, and I picked him up and turned on the light. He claimed that George would not let him sleep and was mad. In order for all of us to get some sleep, I decided that moving the boys into my room was best. That seemed to work for the rest of the time that we lived there. On one of the last days that we were there, we were out in the yard, and the boys were playing as we'd done so many times. I'd forgotten about that wooden gravestone my ex-husband pulled out from the well previously. But here, I was sitting on the porch, and something urged me to really look at the piece of wood. I could see that there was writing on it. It was faded. I had noticed it when we found it, but I hadn't really took a look at it. It was just sitting there, and I was staring at it with the most overwhelming urge to go and read the writing. So that's what I did. As I began reading, I felt my heart sink. The name carved into the wood was George, along with a last name and a birth and death date. At the very bottom, there was a passage that was mostly worn away, making it impossible to read. However, the last few words remained intact, and it read, "He cannot rest until he finds his head." I had my ex-husband put that thing back where he found it. We packed up our things, loaded it into a trailer, and left that place as quickly as possible. Eventually, my oldest boy quit having night terrors, and things returned to normal. I had hoped that if it was never brought up, he would forget about seeing it, since he was only 3 when it happened. But years later, when he was about 13 or so, he brought it up and had some questions. I was stunned that he could remember that. About a year ago, I wanted to see if anyone was living there, so I looked it up on Google Earth, and it is no longer there. I wonder if George ever found his head. Story 4. My husband and I moved into the apartment we currently reside in a little over 2 years ago. It's quite spacious and has updated amenities. There is a master bedroom with a full bath attached and a guest bedroom with a restroom just outside of it. We live on the top floor of a 3-story apartment building and have only one neighbor with whom we share a wall with that is seldom noisy. With that being said, there have been a few instances where I've questioned what I saw and heard. The first few months that we lived there, I'd noticed that the hall light outside of both bedrooms would be on in the morning 2 or 3 times a week. At first, I thought surely it was one of us leaving it on at night and forgetting that we had. Then, after several occurrences, and both my husband and I denying that we left the light on, I decided to verbally acknowledge that I was turning it off. I looked at my husband before we went into the master bedroom that night and said, "Okay, this is me turning off the light, so we know for certain that it should be off in the morning." I said it jokingly, but part of me was serious and needed an explanation. There would be no reason for him or I to venture out in the night because there's a bathroom in the master bedroom, and we always came to bed with full bottles of water. You can imagine my surprise in the morning when I came out while my husband still slept and found the light on yet again. The switch turned up and all. This made my hair stand on end. However, as time went on, the light being on in the hallway lessened and has finally stopped about 6 months ago. I've tried to come up with an explanation for it, and the only thing I could think of is that I may be sleepwalking, which is something I used to do up until about 5 years ago. I don't think this is likely, though, because my husband says he hasn't seen me do it since, and he always used to catch me doing it, from what he tells me, I of course have no memory of it. The next instance happened about a year ago in the master bedroom. I was asleep and was awoken abruptly by a soft sound, or a thud or a pop. The south side of the bedroom has a door that leads to the balcony and always has a bit of light shining through its blind due to the street lights in the parking lot below. As I woke, I turned my head towards the door and saw what looked to be a silhouette of a person standing about a foot in front of it. There was no features, but I could tell by its shoulders and its torso that the figure was male, perhaps about 5'7", and it was wearing a hat. Our bed sits opposite the door, so the figure was turned directly towards us, about 7 feet from the head of my bed. I was so startled that I jolted out of bed and turned on the light for the entire room. My husband was confused, and I didn't explain until morning to him what I had seen. Of course, there was nothing there. My heart would not stop pounding for about 30 minutes after the incident. I tried rationalizing what I saw as a dream leaked over into reality, if you know what I mean. I had a similar instance happen to me when I was about 14 and saw a figure directly next to my bed standing and looking down. It was so close to my bedside lamp that I thought my eyes had played a trick on me. but at the time it felt so real. That figure also vanished as soon as I turned on the light. The final and most significant thing happened to me last night, leading to me writing down all of these occurrences. I was laying on my side of the bed, right side, which has a nightstand and a lamp directly next to it. If you were to lay on your side facing out, you'd be facing a window that lets a little light in, much like the patio door. I fell asleep at about 11:30 p.m. and woke facing the outside exactly 45 minutes later. I checked the clock. I don't know why I woke up, but I immediately noticed something on my nightstand. It was roughly the size of a bird, and that was what my brain made it to be. It was completely black and sitting about a foot from my face. I then saw it move to the left, much like the movement of a bird walking, with a little sway. I was so frightened, I yet again jumped out of my bed and turned on the light, fully expecting there to be a creature on my nightstand. As you can guess, there was nothing when I looked. I checked high and low, no sign of anything, and there had been no noise. I told my husband what I saw. He thought it might have been a dream leaking into reality again. But to me it was so vivid that I was nearly positive there was an animal in the room. I was so exhausted that I wasn't even afraid to turn the light off and attempt to go back to sleep. Here's the odd part. Almost instantly after turning off the light, a memory of my grandfather came into my mind. I could see and hear him so clearly as I lay there trying to fall back to sleep, and the thought of him and his voice eventually led me to drift off. He passed away a little over 4 years ago. There was no reason for me to be thinking of him, and I did not even question it until the morning. Was it him that I saw? A ghost? A dream? Or something else? I'll likely never know. Story 1. My basement has always given me a feeling of fright, so sleeping down there was never an option for me until there was no other option. For context, I always felt watched when down there. There was always an intense feeling of not being alone despite knowing no one else was with me. Well, no one else alive or breathing was with me. For many years I avoided the basement. I would only go if at least 2 others would be with me. I was the type of kid to zoom back up the stairs real fast. I still get the feeling of something being behind me as I go back up. Currently, I only go into the basement to grab frozen food or to do my laundry. The feeling I've always gotten down there has never left me though. This story takes place in July 2018. I was 12 when it happened. It was a hot summer that year. The air was very humid and it felt sweltering outside. The air conditioner in our home had recently stopped working, and the house had started to become unbearably hot. The only spot in the house that was cold was the basement, so that is where we had to sleep for a few days. The first few nights were fine, nothing happened at all until the night before the air conditioner was fixed. That night I was struggling to sleep. I felt so uncomfortable for absolutely no reason. I just brushed it off as most 12-year-olds would. I went to bed at 12ish that night. After what felt like seconds, I awoke abruptly. I remember sitting up and looking towards the small space under the stairs that led into a storage room. I saw a figure slowly gliding towards me from the stair space. I don't remember exactly how this figure looked, but I remember it being black, solid, and its shape reminded me of a blob. I remember closing my eyes after that, but that's all I can remember of that one. I assume I had fallen back to sleep. Once again, I wake up abruptly after what felt like minutes of sleep. This time, instead of looking at the darkest spot, I looked at the laundry room entryway. I thought if I looked towards the most lit up area, then I wouldn't see anything scary. Thinking about it now, I don't see it as scary, but younger me sure did. Instead of seeing an empty doorway, I saw another blob-like figure. It was almost like the last one, except this one was pure white and had black spots for eyes. It was solid white. You couldn't see through it. No light seemed to pass through it either, but it didn't have a shadow. Like the last one, it seemed to glide towards me. Before it could get even 6 feet away from me, I hid under my blanket. I fell asleep almost instantly after. I slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I grabbed all my stuff and headed upstairs. Ever since then, I have not slept in the basement. Story 2. So this happened when I was about 15 years old, I believe. For years, actually, as long as I can remember, I could hear voices when I listened. If you don't know what I mean by that, you probably can't understand, but I call it Channel 1 and Channel 2. Channel 1 is the normal way you hear things. Channel 2 is the other way. Sorry if you don't understand what I mean by that. I'm not an expert enough in this stuff to explain or even defend it as a real thing. I have no idea how it works, but in Channel 2 you can hear all kinds of things. Voices, music, moaning, laughing. It all sort of depends on what is in the air around you at the time. Some locations are thick with it, some aren't, but it's all there in the wind. That's when I hear it best, anyway. At night, though, when the wind is blowing, mostly it's just voices. Not a single voice, but distant babble, hard to ignore, because it gets louder if you listen close, and it's hard not to listen in the dark. Worse, if you listen too close in the wrong place on the wrong night, other things start happening. Mostly at night, but not always, as in this story. This happened in broad daylight. I was laying in bed at my brother's place. It was a small apartment on Mather Street he shared with my cousin near the Fox River in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I crashed there sometimes. Well, this particular day, the voices were very loud and I was very tired because I had been up all night, but I couldn't fall asleep because the voices kept getting louder beneath me until it felt as if the bed was shaking underneath me. Now, that might seem terrifying at first glance, but it had happened before, and I had then, and still have, a simple rule about weird stuff. If someone else didn't see it, feel it, or hear it, then it isn't real. Zero exceptions. So the wind is blowing outside, and I'm trying to sleep. And for almost an hour, I tried to ignore the hallucination keeping me awake until, tired and frustrated, I got out of bed and went into the living room where my cousin Todd was talking to a couple of girls who lived nearby and were over for friendly flirting or whatever. I asked if Todd would come talk to me for a minute in the bedroom. He agreed and followed me into the room where I shut the door behind him. "What's up?" Todd asked, and I asked him to sit down on the bed a second, and that's about as long as he did sit down before he jumped up like something bit him and started cursing and staring at the bed. Cutting into the story a second, another of my little rules regarding weird stuff is that I never tell someone with me what it is I see or hear. I ask what the person with me sees or hears, so I know they actually do see or hear whatever it is I think I see or hear. Sorry if that seems a sort of burdensome, but it's the only way I can really know for sure they are being honest with me. I have trust issues, possibly. "The bed is effing shaking," Todd said, at which point, feeling entirely vindicated, I pumped my fist and said, "I effing knew it. I knew it." Then we swore a lot more. We were both teenagers and thought that made us adults, I suppose. And the bed eventually stopped shaking, and I felt very pleased with myself, and Todd decided the house was haunted, or more likely I was haunted. But that didn't ruin my mood because this had been going on for years, and hooray, I wasn't crazy. And then it started to get dark. I realized all those nights I heard voices and the bed was shaking might not have been hallucinations. I started wishing I hadn't had Todd come sit on the bed. Story 3. In 1986, my parents purchased and moved into a house. It was an older home and had been inhabited before. I've heard that during the 1970s, it was owned by the boys' basketball coach from the local high school. Supposedly, he was a predator and was fired for making advances towards his team members. This is unsubstantiated. I was born in 1988 and lived there until we moved to another house across town in early 2004. I was 15 and a half at the time. During my childhood, I experienced a variety of troubling phenomena and was very well troubled as a result. I constantly felt as if I was being watched, followed, and having my thoughts read. I also felt that something was listening to me when I spoke. As a result, I was always afraid and could never be left alone. I was always running up and down stairs, looking behind me and looking over my shoulder. There was also visual and auditory phenomena. Often out of the corner of my eye, I saw shadow figures darting through rooms and then disappearing. One night in the summer of 1998, I heard guttural laughter emanating from the far corner of my room. It seemed to echo and multiply itself before eventually fading and ending. In early 2003, I heard a few tortured-sounding voices calling my name, again in my bedroom. The phenomenon was the most intense in the upstairs, my bedroom, and in the back room of the basement. It seemed to decline and eventually end as I entered puberty. At the time, both my parents were staunch evangelical Christians who believed firmly in the existence of spirits. Oddly enough, however, my father did not take me seriously and dismissed it as a form of separation anxiety. As a result, he took no action on my behalf. In hindsight, I should have been taken to a therapist to determine if this was simply a product of my mind, and if so, why was my mind producing it? If it was not, they should have consulted a religious official to have the house examined and, if needed be, cleansed. Alas, he did neither. In fact, it didn't even occur to him to do either, and I lived in a torment as a result. His lame Band-Aid solution was to stay up with me until I fall asleep. I was discussing this with my mother recently, and what she said surprised me. She conceded to me that she too had experienced exactly the same phenomena. However, she began to feel it when they first moved in 1986, and for her it lasted until we moved in early 2004. Basically, the entire time she lived in the house. She even discussed it with my father. For his part, he maintains he never experienced anything out of the ordinary there, except for a vague sensation of darkness once in the back of the basement. This has left me with nothing but questions. Was there a connection between the activities of the previous inhabitant and what I experienced? Why, despite my parents' religious faith, were the entities capable of entering our home and afflicting us? Why did my mother and I experience it, but not my father? Why was my father so passive and complacent in dealing with it? I would love an answer to any of these questions. Story 4. Alright, so I'm not sure where to start, so I'll begin with a little background on my story. This was in 2012 in Rothschild, Wisconsin. I had found out that the original idea for the movie Poltergeist was based on a house a block over from mine. It explained a lot of phenomena that happened in my home. So my stepfather is diagnosed with brain cancer. My family and I are looking for a house. We come upon a house in a nice neighborhood for a steal. It is a $1,200 a month for a 4-bed, 3-bath home with everything you could want. It was built recently and just massive. I have only been there a little while and weird things happen, like my stuff going missing, stuff turning on and off, and sounds of movement from different areas of the house. I had 2 siblings, so I paid very little attention to it. Well, on this night I was home alone at 15 years old. I had my earphones in and was doing homework when a black figure came crawling at me from my peripheral. It gave me a heart attack, and I tell my black lab, Jake, that he's an ass. Well, lo and behold, my dog is with my parents. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and I'm in the kitchen making myself a sandwich when I hear something burrowing down the stairs. I turn around, and it rounds the corner from the stairs leading upstairs, and there is what I can only describe as an oil-black, deformed spider man with no face. As soon as I made eye contact with it, it crawled at me with such swiftness that I couldn't react. And not going to lie, guys, I peed myself. I called my best friend crying and waited outside until she picked me up. A few days later, I found out about this part of town being on a Native American burial ground. So fast forward a few more weeks, and I'm sitting in the living room, and I got this feeling of just dread, sadness, and defeat. And once again I hear something running upstairs from the basement. This time, this thing didn't stop to look at me. It just ran at me, and I panicked. I didn't know what to do. The thing would be on top of me within 3 seconds. I finally told my mom that although my stepfather having cancer and needing treatment that is out of town, that she couldn't leave me alone home anymore. I felt safer even if I had someone with me. Even my little siblings. Me being a person who liked being alone, she didn't understand why. I finally told her, thinking she would think I was crazy. Her eyes widened. I asked her what was wrong. Her response, "I've been seeing the same thing, Gabby, and I don't know what to do." I had never seen her so fearful. Things just became worse. I haven't been able to find anything on this creature, so if anyone knows anything, please comment for me. My mom moved us out of the house shortly after when my sister claimed to be pushed down the stairs and my stepfather's cancer started progressing quickly. I tried to put as much detail into this as possible, but I am very terrified and started having nightmares of this thing again. Story 5. When I was about 4 years old, we moved into a big old house on a retired farm near Elk Mound, Wisconsin. We called it the Fisher Farm, since that was the name of the landlord. Likely because I was so small, the house seemed gigantic. It was a 2-story home with a full attic and basement, a nice sunroom, a wide open oak staircase, and large bay windows, but it only had one bathroom, which was upstairs. With the house being that large, and winters in Wisconsin being so brutally cold, it was a challenge for my parents to heat it. My father bought a space heater, and all 6 of us slept in the toy room off from the kitchen during cold snaps in winter. During one of these cold snaps, I had to go to the bathroom in the dead of night. My mom told my oldest sister, we'll call her Sophie, not her real name, to take me. She was slow to wake up, but I really had to go. Without turning on any lights, I went into the kitchen and through the swinging door to the dining room, but was stopped short when I saw a woman standing on the landing of the staircase. She was garbed in a long white dressing gown or robe with a matching nightcap, which resembled today's shower cap, only was made of cottony material. She had a long brunette braid resting over her left shoulder, while holding a candle which illuminated her features. She was very pretty, probably in her early 30s. I think I could probably draw her if I tried. She didn't smile or talk, she just stood there looking at me. I wasn't as frightened as I was intrigued. I knew she wasn't supposed to be there, but there she was. I presume I didn't know I was supposed to be scared. The most I knew about ghosts I learned from Saturday morning's Great Dane Scooby-Doo. Of course, those meddling kids always debunked those ghosts and monsters. They never had a woman standing on a staircase in their home in the middle of the night. I don't know how long I stood and looked at her, but I really wanted Sophie to see her. I turned to go back and hurry up, but she came through the swinging door and the lady was gone. I wonder now if the lady showed herself to me because I was about to ascend the long stairway in the dark, and she was, after all, carrying a candle. We only lived there a few years, but I had other experiences in that time. I would hear people talking, laughing, and whispering in the night. I would hear footsteps on the main floor from my bed upstairs that sounded like boots on the hardwood floors. I tried rationalizing it and told myself John Wayne was down there. One morning I woke to see a small man with curly gray hair standing at the foot of my bed. I was scared of the shadow on the wall in one of the bedrooms that looked like a man's side profile. Mom said it was where the paint had run. She ended up putting a dresser in front of the shadow/stain. She had also been spooked in the house on several occasions. One night while she was there alone, she heard a pile of pipes fall to the floor from the bedroom above her. My uncle stayed one night in the house and never stayed again. Several years after we moved, I met a guy in school who was living in the house at the time. He was a class clown, always smiling and being funny. I asked him if weird stuff ever happened in his house. He looked at me without a smile and told me in all seriousness that a lot of weird stuff happened there. I don't remember everything he told me, but he did say they were unable to get the stain off the bedroom wall until they paneled it. I never understood why I was the one who had so many paranormal experiences on the Fisher Farm. I didn't have any similar experiences after moving from there until I was a teenager. In my 40s, I met a lady who was something of a medium or psychic. I'm not sure what her title is, but she has certain abilities. When she first met me, she told me straightforwardly I was sensitive. The older I get, the more that seems to be true. I don't talk about it with my family so much as they would tell me I'm crazy. Seeing the woman on the stairway happened about 48 years ago. The house is still standing, looking like a charming country home. I wish I knew who owns it today. I'd like to walk through it and talk to people. I never learned the history of the house, but I'd like to research it. It's probably over 100 years old. Before Halloween each year, my friend and I take personal ghost tour of reportedly haunted places in our area. It's about a 6-mile to 60-mile drive. I have the Fisher Farm on it. When we went last week I could see the very spot through the big bay window where I saw that lady. Of course, she wasn't there, but I wonder if anybody else in the last 48 years has seen her. Story 1. I'm submitting this story on behalf of myself and older brother. The events described took place in Louisiana, rural Acadia Parish. I was 4 years old. My brother was not quite 6 years old. What transpired was real, not imagined, not a dream. It absolutely was not of this world. I saw a man of pure white light. My brother saw a man of pure white light. I will refer to him as Light Man. We saw this man on separate occasions outside a window of the bedroom we shared. We don't know who saw Light Man first or how much time elapsed between the sightings. We do know that the sightings took place in late summer, August or September 1960. First, my sighting. I was asleep in my bed, which was situated sideways against an open window. There was no screen on this window. I woke up, my head lying against the windowsill. I don't know if something awakened me. My eyes briefly gazed up at the stars before I caught a glimpse of a man made of white light standing just to the right of the window. I was terrified. I pulled back slightly and stared at him for several seconds. His features were very well defined. Slender face, small nose, short hair, average-sized eyes and ears. He was wearing a suit, a shirt, tie, coat, and pants. Everything was white light, but I could clearly distinguish between clothing and body. I attempted to scream for my mother, but I was so terrified that no words came out of my mouth. Then Light Man slowly began moving to the left, across my window. His head was tilted slightly backwards, chin slightly elevated. He stared straight ahead. I pulled even further backwards, away from the window, intently watching him. As soon as he slid past the window, I stuck my head out and watched him march towards the corner of the house. I use the word march because that's what he was doing. The legs of his stiff frame were goose-stepping while his arms hung straight down, motionless. He marched until he reached the corner, then he made a crisp left turn and vanished. At this point, I was finally able to scream for my mother. She came running, and I told her there was a man outside the window. She immediately assumed I'd been dreaming, but I adamantly insisted that this wasn't a dream. She suddenly became concerned that maybe someone had been at the window and took me by the hand, grabbed something like a rod or stick from the kitchen, I don't recall exactly what it was, and took me into the backyard, tightly clenching my hand. We cautiously walked across the yard and saw nothing. I told her Light Man had walked around the corner of the house. We did likewise and again saw nothing. At this point she relaxed and insisted I'd been dreaming. We re-entered the house and she took me back to my bed. I begged her to let me sleep with her, but she refused because my 2.5-year-old brother was already in her bed. I was hysterical, but she didn't relent. She did close the window before walking off. I got in my bed, shaking, and pulled as far away from the window as possible. I lay there trembling until I fell asleep. Now my brother's sighting. He was asleep in the same room, also near a window. There was a screen on the window. He woke up one night and saw Light Man standing slightly to the left of the window. He watched as Light Man slowly walked past the window, head tilted back, chin elevated until he was out of sight. He didn't see the same level of facial detail, but it was the same left-facing profile, same mannerisms, same right-to-left movement that I'd witnessed. For some reason, he felt no fear and went back to sleep. We had no air conditioning in our home, hence we slept with open windows. The house was in a very isolated location, with one neighbor about half a mile away. There were no other neighbors for at least a couple of miles. We never discussed what happened until it came up more than 20 years later while having pizza at a local restaurant. He had never breathed a word of what happened to anyone. I carried my secret for approximately 17 years before sharing it with the woman who eventually became my wife. My brother decided to share what he'd experienced with us. Before he finished his story, my jaw dropped as chills shot through my body. My wife and I stared at one another in disbelief. I then told my story and watched my brother's stunned reaction. We spent the remainder of the evening comparing notes and pinpointing the time frame of the sightings. For decades, we have shared our story with others, hoping to gain some understanding of what we saw and why it happened to us. We've learned nothing. Now, both in our 60s, we'd like more than ever to discover if anyone else has had similar experience, or if someone can offer insight about these truly remarkable events. This story has been told exactly as it happened, with no embellishments whatsoever. Story 2. My experience happened in 2015. I had just moved back to New Orleans from Florida and gotten an apartment. Then came Hurricane Katrina. My parents and I evacuated to my sister's house in Pennsylvania. We were very stressed, especially my mom. My sister had a large old house, and Mom and Dad and I were sleeping downstairs, them in a bedroom and I on the living room sofa. My sister slept upstairs. At 4 a.m., I woke to my sis, Heather, standing over me and telling me to get up. Frantic, she asked if I heard Mom sobbing loudly, and I said I did not. We went upstairs and she told me what happened. She was sleeping and awoke to the sound of Mom sobbing and screaming coming from outside. She looked out her bedroom window and saw Mom leaning against a tree, yelling into her phone. She thought, "What's going on?" Heather ran downstairs and opened the door. Mom wasn't out there and it was silent. Confused, she ran back inside to wake up Dad. She was shocked to see Mom in bed with Dad, sound asleep. That's when she got me up. We went upstairs and she's telling me what's going on, when suddenly we heard Mom sobbing and screaming at the top of her lungs, sounding like she was at the foot of the stairs. We started running down, and when we reached the bottom, everything went completely silent. I vividly remember the atmosphere feeling thick and prickly. We went into the bedroom to wake Dad up, and there was Mom sleeping with Dad. They were both deeply asleep. We roused them both and related to them what happened. We were all at a loss to explain this experience. To this day, we still talk about it. My sister and I have witnessed other strange events, always together. Thanks for reading my story, and I wish you the best. Story 3. I have a few experiences with a black hooded figure with an expressionless white face, starting in 2012. I've pretty much kept this on the down low except for telling my wife and pastor. It started as what I thought was night terrors. I'm laying in my bed watching TV, and as I turned my head to get my remote, I saw a figure in front of my closet. I immediately froze. This figure wore a black hood, but didn't have a white face. It looked like a normal older man, but with an angry, sinister look at it and a reddish face. I'm only adding this in case of a connection and to give a backstory of when things started getting odd for me. Well, after maybe 10 seconds or so, I regained control of my body, and the being disappeared. Fast forward about a year later, I'm staying at my aunt's house at this time. I look outside and see this figure wearing a black hood and an expressionless white face facing my direction. It almost looked like it had to be a mask instead of a face. I would put it off as just my mind playing tricks on me until I seen it a few times at my aunt's and at my work over the course of about a year and a half. Had an experience with my aunt's Pomeranian where he seemed to have been dragged into a room and the door slammed shut. He was cowering under the bed, which is abnormal for this dog. It was just me and my cousin in the house, and she was in the room opposite the house when this occurred. Not sure if it's relevant, but it happened during the time span. Finally, one day I was leaving for work in the afternoon. As I'm about to walk out of the living room, I see this being come from the ground right beside me. Then I smelled wet dog. We had no dog at this time, so it wasn't the Pomeranian. This scent was extremely strong. I then heard a growl coming from behind me, and I could swear I felt something else in the room with me, and this being. The being appeared to be pulled back into the ground relatively fast, and then the smell went away. This incident was in 2014. For some reason, it is currently on my mind and won't leave my head. I googled what I put as the title of this and found people with similar experiences on this site, so I decided to share. I don't know what to make of it. I have had no paranormal incidents since then. Story 4. It seems like there's never a time where I can legitimately say I've not experienced some type of paranormal experience. I grew up in a small town in South Louisiana, surrounded by the bayous. The house I grew up in was well known around town for an incident that happened years before my father bought the place. A religious cult had lived there before, and a young girl that was part of the cult gave birth to a stillborn child. Instead of doing the normal routine of a funeral then burial, this cult instead decided that they would take the baby's body around door to people's houses in an ice chest and ask the people to help pray the baby back to life. Yes, not joking, the old people around my town can tell you all about it. I never knew about it until I was a teenager and one of my friend's mom was bringing me back home one night from a party. She drove up and just looked at me in awe and said, "Oh my, you actually live here?" I suddenly became very interested in as to why she would react that way, so I questioned her. She told me the whole story, and instead of being terrified to go back into my home, yes, I was scared in a way, but I was more appalled at what that cult had done. I suddenly came to understand why I'd always felt the way I did there and why my family was experiencing the things they were. My bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, and I cannot remember a time that I did not run down that hallway to enter or leave my room. Never failed. I would get to the beginning of the hallway and suddenly feel a heaviness around me, and I would get a knot in my stomach and start to breathe faster. Then I would run as fast as I could until I would get into the bedroom and then slam the door, suddenly calm down. It's like I felt something was staying in that hallway for some reason. I cannot explain it. We would also hear children laughing at times, and we even heard a baby crying. My friend was spending the night, as usual, and we were just coming to the second hallway that led to my room. My little brother's bedroom was also off that hallway. His was at the very beginning of it, and his bedroom door exited to the right. While his bedroom door was open, I'd like to mention that he was not home at the time. He was with his best friend fishing a few streets behind our house. And as soon as my best friend and I stepped into the hallway, we heard a baby start crying, and it was coming from my brother's room. Needless to say, she and I hightailed it out of there and ran outside and stayed in the backyard until the sun went down and we were forced back into the house. It seemed it would only target my brother and I. My mother would have some small experiences, but I think she was so accustomed to it that it became the norm to her. My father, on the other hand, never had anything happen to him. Could be because he was rarely home when I was growing up. He was an offshore oil rig electrician, so he'd be gone for half a month at a time, but it always seemed to like me the most. There was one night that I woke up to a face above mine, literally about 6 inches above mine. It was not like a normal face though, it was more so made of almost a mist-like substance. I could only make out the remnants of eyes, nose, and mouth. I was of course frozen in place and just stared at it. Then it suddenly dissipated right in front of my eyes. I would always hear knocking on my bedroom door, open it and find no one there. I would hear my name called all the time when no one was in my home calling me. I would feel my hands on my arms or back. It became constant. Then one day, I met my best friend, Guy, who was a medium. He is 4 years older than I am. I was 14 at the time. He was 18. We began to talk on the phone every day. It was never romantic between us. It was a brother-sister type relationship. In fact, we are still very close to this day, and my children call him Uncle. And that was one way I could escape from the suffocating feeling I felt in that home. He was the one who told me that everything I was going through was not in my head, that it was all real. In fact, my home was so haunted that he had a hard time walking into it sometimes. He said there were over 22 ghosts in and around my home. No joke. The house I grew up in was extremely old, and so was the land there, of course. Who knows what happened on it before our house was even built. All you have to do is pick up a history book or Google it to see how messed up it was in South Louisiana back centuries ago. He also told me that the reason why I was experiencing it so much more than anyone else in my home was because I am an empath and sensitive to the spirits as well. I can sense them, hear and see them at times. It made so much sense to me finally. I didn't like hearing that, of course, but I had to accept it. My friend told me that he would prepare himself and try to help us. He came by the house and he performed a cleansing ritual. Well, it seemed like it worked for a few weeks, then it all started up again. He told me he was sorry, but there was just too many of them for him to fully get rid of it. I ended up living in that house for another 4 years. My father finally decided to move us out of there when I graduated high school. I remember the day I moved out of that house. It was the home I had been living in since I was 4, so of course I had an attachment to it. And oddly enough, I felt an attachment to some of the spirits there. Not all, just the ones who I felt comfortable with at times. I remember breaking up with my boyfriend one night and crying on my bed and suddenly feeling arms around me tightly, so I know not all of them were bad. I remember standing there in the empty living room, crying for them. I felt guilty for leaving them alone again. Will the next people who moved in acknowledge them like I did? I know I sound crazy for feeling that way, but it was like leaving family. Our new place was nice, no spirits there at all, and it felt nice not to have to run to my room every time. So I lived a spirit-free life for many years. I believe I had closed off that part of me that was sensitive to spirits after I left that house. Fast forward 8 years, I'm living in a beautiful Washington state, pregnant with my first child, a son, and I suddenly start feeling like I'm being called back home. Of course, I was missing my family down in Louisiana like crazy, but I was enjoying my new life in a new state with my fiance. But it was strong, and I would cry at night and want to be back in Louisiana. My fiance suddenly said, "You know what? Let's move down there." I was ecstatic, and we flew back down there in October of 2006. The next month, on November 29th, my world changed forever. My mother, who was my rock, my world, everything to me, suddenly died unexpectedly. I had spoken to her just hours before she had died, according to the coroner's report. My stepfather, my parents ended up divorcing right after we moved out of the house. Came home from work and found her lying in the bathroom. It took us months to get the autopsy report back, and everything came back inconclusive. They chalked it up as a heart attack. My mother was extremely healthy and thin, no heart problems, so it was a big shock. I always wonder how I knew to come back home just in time. Was it my intuition? Was it something else? I'll never know. But I do know that after that, everything changed. I had a dream after her funeral about me looking into a mirror and pulling a giant nail out of my forehead where the third eye is, and there was a gaping hole, and suddenly an eye blinked back at me. Yes, it was quite disturbing. Since then, almost 12 years ago, I've had constant experiences no matter where I live. Every single house or apartment I've lived in since then, something always happens. I have plenty more to share with you on those experiences, but those I'll save for separate stories. Story 5. This is one of my own personal accounts, which is a bunch of separate things that happened to me when I was in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was on vacation, and it was this December 15th, and a lot of bad things happened in one day, to put it bluntly. There was almost a couple of fights between different people, friends and family I was hanging out with. Went out to hang out with my cousin at some bars later that night, dancing and stuff, and lost my only souvenir I planned on taking back home. And then later that night, we lose some money. Same night, we're walking back to our hotel room, a little drunk, okay, very, very drunk, but we're just walking back, and we're walking by this one club that we didn't even go into, and a bouncer suddenly spits on my cousin, and before I can get the words out of my mouth, what the hell was that about, I got sucker punched and sprawled across the ground, trying to get my drunk butt back up to my feet and put my hands up to keep from getting pummeled. In that punch, I also got my favorite necklace knocked off of my neck that night. So we go back to the hotel. I'm blacking out, having a really bad night. It's still the same day, and I go to sleep. We get on the airplane the next day to come home, and I find out that the same day that all that happened to me, one of my cats died. My cat died in my mom's old bedroom, in the exact same spot my mom died 5 or 6 years before that, in the same room on the same day. So safe to say I don't like December 15th much. And to end the story, the last thing I'm going to leave you with was the first thing that happened to me when I got to New Orleans. We arrived at the hotel and we're going inside, and there's an elevator to go up and there's a staircase. You got to get the keys to the staircase. So I have a few of my nieces and nephews with me, and we get the keys to the staircase because we don't want to wait for the elevator. We go up the first set of stairs and use the key on the next door. We go through the door, the girls are in front of me, and I'm right behind them, and we start going up the stairs, and there's clearly a man standing less than a foot in front of them on the stairs, going up right with us. My nieces are so close to this man, I'm thinking of yelling at them and saying they're rude for being so close to this guy, give him some space. But I didn't say anything. We got up to our floor, got off the staircase, and then I brought it up to him, and not a single other person in that staircase saw the man in the front of us. Just me. That's all. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. I'd like to start off by saying I've always thought the paranormal and ghosts were TV and Hollywood made up nonsense. I worked part-time at a local daycare ran by a family friend while taking night classes. For the family friend's privacy, I won't say the name of the daycare. The first day I started working was fun. I love kids and enjoy spending time with them. There was something odd though. I'm not using her real name. Anne, a 4-year-old, kept talking about someone called Big Bro. Yet when I asked her parents, they said she was an only child. I passed it off as an imaginary friend, forgot about it. The first paranormal event, I'd call it, happened back in November. It was cold, so the heat was on constantly. Yet when I would walk into the playroom, it was cold. I checked the vent in case it was covered, but I could feel heat coming from the vent. Then I checked the window, it was completely shut. I walked back in a few hours later to clean up the kids' toys, and it was warm like the other rooms. A few days later, I was checking in on the babies while they were supposed to be napping, but some are little escape artists. I opened the door and saw Bobby, not his real name. He was halfway over the side of the crib. When I caught him, he froze or got scared and let go of the rail. The distance between his crib and the door is a rough 14 feet. I ran for him, but the really freaky part is he stopped mid-air halfway to the floor. Then he was lowered onto the floor. I grabbed him and ran out of the room. I went to Emily, not a real name, and told her what happened. She said, "Relax, dear, that's just Chris." I was dumbfounded. She acted like it was normal. I guess the look of disbelief showed, and then Emily went more into detail. She said Chris worked here for years, making the kids happy, but a few months before I started working here, he passed away due to an asthma attack. The kids loved him, and they had taken to calling him Big Bro. They can see him because they are so young and innocent. He helps out still, even after passing away. She told me on occasion she still can see him playing with the kids. A baby would be giggling up a storm, and they were alone. A block would lift up by itself, or the rocking chair he'd read to them in would rock by itself. I've had similar things since our chat. One time I was trying to comfort one of the babies while they were fussy. I tripped over a toy and fell back. I wrapped up the baby and got ready for the pain, but I never hit the ground. I was pushed back up, and I heard a whistling like a lullaby. The baby calmed down. The kids still say they can see Big Bro, and I walked into the playroom to clean up, and all the toys are already put away. I feel fortunate that my first run-in with the paranormal has been such a positive one. Story 2. In 2001, my mother moved to Atlanta, Georgia for 4 months for her job. I lived with her, but I stayed home in Mississippi instead of going with her. I believe it was April of that year. I had gone out with my best friend clubbing, something we had always did on the weekend when I was in my 20s. We had a great time out that night. When the club let out, I drove him home. Then I went right home afterwards and got into my bed and went to sleep. I will never forget this as long as I live. I was sleeping good, but all of a sudden I woke up standing in the middle of my bedroom. I do not sleepwalk or wake up and jump out of bed for a few minutes, but as I was standing in the middle of my room, I looked at the clock and it was 5:34 a.m. As I turned to look at my bed, all of a sudden my bed was on fire at the top where I was sleeping. I was able to grab my comforter, and though the flames were rising, I was able to put the fire out easily. I was so sleepy that I just went to sleep on the couch. I woke up around 9 in the morning, thinking that was one crazy vivid dream I had. First thing I noticed was that I had my window up, although it was in the low 50s or upper 40s outside. When I walked into my room, I saw that my comforter had a big hole in it. I didn't freak out, but there was no way possible to know that my bed was about to go up in flames that night. As I was thinking that somehow I dodged a bullet, I vaguely remembered that I felt a force yank me out of bed, and that is why I was standing in the middle of the room, and that is the absolute truth. I also remember that the smoke alarm went off at the same time it occurred, but when I checked it, there were no batteries in it, so it was impossible for it to go off like it did. To this day, I wonder if this was a loved one or a guardian angel that yanked me out of bed just in time. When I checked to see what could have caused that to happen, I saw my extension receptacle had shorted because I had my bed pressed up against it, exposing the wires in the extension cord. That morning will stay with me forever. Story 3. This is really scary and I'm a little shocked. This just happened about 30 minutes ago at 5:30 a.m. I kept waking up throughout the night because my pillow kept falling over. I kept pushing it off the side of the bed with my head, and I could feel its absence every now and then, and I'd wake up. I don't sleep in the dark because I've had a few occurrences that have left me terrified of being alone and unable to see. In my bathroom, my dogs were sleeping on the floor and the light was left on like it always is. I feel my pillow isn't under my head anymore, so I open my eyes to get it from the floor, when I see what at first I thought was myself, and freaked out. I literally said, "Oh shit," things I don't blurt out. It had my hair, but was all black, and the face was off. I can't really remember because it was gone in like 3 seconds. The first thing I thought once it was gone was, did I just see myself? The only light I had was from the bathroom, so it was almost like a shadow. I'm not sure. I've always thought I saw things or could hear things, but this is the first time I actually saw something that was actually solid with my own eyes. I'm not too bothered by it. I'm just not sure I want to go back to sleep anymore. I don't want to wake up and have that thing closer to me. I have one of those TV dinner tables next to my bed because I was eating on it the previous night. That thing was hovering next to it, bent over, staring at me. It wasn't touching the floor. It seemed as if it was floating. I'm not sure what it was, but I know I was awake and I wasn't dreaming. Story 4. This is my first paranormal experience. I was a firm skeptic and believed after we died, it's over. It all began when I was 10. My family and I moved from Indiana here to be closer to my mother's family. We lived roughly half a block away from them. I will be fast forwarding to the later years as well. When we first moved in, I had a bad feeling due to several things only I picked up on. This is a 1-story, 4-bedroom, 2-bath home. Anytime I'd walk from my room to the kitchen, I'd get this feeling like my instincts saying, "Run, something's behind you." Also, I kept getting a nauseous feeling anytime I was in the hall bathroom. My family and I began hearing noises. This was a fairly old home, built in the early to late 60s. We assumed it was an animal, so my father called an exterminator. The exterminator said there's no vermin in there, not even a nook or cranny that can get in through. The noises continued. After that, things escalated. Things would disappear only to reappear in the hall bath and the sink cabinet. Needless to say, my parents blamed us, and they seemed to change. They were both very loving, but now they'd fight over the smallest details. My little sister began hearing growling in her bedroom and what sounded like pacing at night. I began hearing knocking on my window at night, not a frenzied knock, more like a steady let me in knock. I assumed it was other kids pranking me. One night I was in a foul mood. Can't remember why exactly, but for the first time I opened the curtains and no one was there. It takes 2 seconds to get to my window from the bed. I was shocked, to say the least. I told my parents and they said I was imagining things. Things got worse after that. My sister would wake up screaming that a shadow was after her. My parents passed it off as a normal nightmare. She still has that nightmare to this day. This is where I skip ahead a few years. I was 16. My parents had divorced 3 years prior. I was working out in my room lifting barbells. It's about 8 o'clock at night. The tapping had stopped after I opened the curtains when I was 10. It suddenly began again. I opened them again, nothing there. At this time my sister was 11. She still had the nightmare, and she and I both began being scratched. If it was once in a while, it'd be nothing, but this was nightly, and we began getting what looked like 2 whole bite marks. The marks were roughly human canine bite size. I spoke to the granddaughter of the family we purchased the house from. They did not have any paranormal activity while living there. However, she had told me when her aunt was 16, she had taken her own life in the hall bathroom by drinking a large amount of rat poison mixed with juice. I talked to a friend who was into the paranormal. He said take sage and burn it to get smoke in every corner of the house. I did as instructed and everything stopped for 2 months, but I think it angered this entity because it came back worse. 2 months after the saging, my sister began seeing the shadow out of her dreams, and so did I. This entity, as best as I could describe, looked like an old cowboy silhouette cutout hat, and all but wearing a trench coat with glowing red eyes. We are still experiencing this creature to this day. I've since married and moved out, but my mother and sister still reside in the home. How can we get rid of this entity, and do they have to move? Story 5. My childhood best friend had a great deal of paranormal activity around him, and when I say that, he was perhaps both unintentionally and purposely at times inviting extremely dark, extremely negative energies into his personal space. And I've chosen to not relay the majority of the stories that happened essentially solely to him for a few different reasons, including the fact that I wasn't there, can't remember all the things that happened in the order that they did, etc. But I will tell this one. This took place a few years ago. It was late at night, and he and I were walking around his yard. He lived on the outskirts of the forest, where sometimes you could see, hear, or sense things. On this particular night, wandering around, we heard such a strange sound. It was almost like a gathering of some sort, with someone talking into a microphone, but everything said was so garbled. It was loud, yet you couldn't make out a single word. At first we assumed it was coming from further downtown and decided to walk in that direction, but after a few minutes the location of the source of the noise would change. In other words, if it had been behind us before, it was now in front of us. If it had been northwest, we turned around and faced and it was northeast. It would suddenly switch to the south. If we turned to face the south, it would be to the east. Let me be clear, when I'm saying this is not that noise was coming from all around us. It was mostly in one direction. It was more like it was coming from only in that direction, but would change location completely as soon as we tried to go where it was. It happened a few different times before he and I decided to go back in. Once we were inside, we could no longer hear the noise. Even though the walls were thin, and if we had been outside standing right next to the trailer, we would have been hearing it. His brother and sister-in-law, who lived with us, hadn't heard anything when we asked them. Nothing else happened the weekend I was there that I can remember, but something did happen when I arrived back home Sunday evening. I remember sitting at my computer, reading about a non-related topic, when I felt this awful black energy the opposite side of my room. I can't explain it other than to say that my room suddenly had a horrible energy, but it wasn't the room itself, nor was I just creeped out. It was specifically emanating from that corner. I was too scared to even move from the computer. I would try to glance over with my peripherals, but saw nothing, just felt it. I lasted perhaps 30 minutes with that terror, but by then I was exhausted, frustrated, so I stood up, straightened my back, and said, "You need to leave immediately. Leave my room, don't linger in this area, never return." At that age, I was pretty shy with everyone, but I said it so firmly that I could barely even believe I was the one that said it. And as soon as I felt it leave, almost slowly, but not quite. After a minute or so, the room felt completely normal. I never felt anything quite like that again. As I said before, that friend had been dealing with a lot of negative energies, and is quite possibly still dealing with them. I fully believe that that thing was in my room that night, followed me home, that it was perhaps the same thing that had been tormenting him, or was perhaps another entity that wanted to see if I would go along with it. I've dealt with other paranormal events, but this is honestly probably one of the scariest for me, if not the scariest, solely because of how evil that thing felt. And I am honestly so happy to be a part of a website that allows people to share their experiences. Thank you for reading. Story 6. This took place in my parents' home, but before I tell my story, I want you to know I never heard of a shadow person before. I knew nothing about their existence, but that was about to change. In my childhood home, we had a lot of unexplained things happen. Lights would cut on and off, the faucets would run, we heard walking in the hall, we heard voices, we saw little twinkly lights that would dance around in the dark. I heard growling and something calling my name. My sister had moved in to my parents' house with her 2 children. She was going through a divorce and needed a place to stay. Their room was next to mine, connected by a bathroom we shared. I had just woken up. It was early morning. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was shining through the window. I could see everything. I could hear my mother and sister talking in the kitchen. They were talking about me. See, I had just graduated from high school and didn't have any plans for college. I laid there listening to them. My mom said I was a screw-up, but to be fair, how was I to go to college without any money? My father made too much for financial aid, and they didn't have anything put back for me. As I lay there listening, I started to cry. I must have fallen asleep. Next thing I noticed, my bed started shaking. I laid there for a minute thinking it was the washer shaking the house, but then it got to where the shaking was strong. I turned over, and to my surprise, there was a shadow in the shape of a human at the end of my bed. I didn't feel fearful, and then the shadow spoke. All it said was, "Hi, Elizabeth," and then it was gone. I got up after that, but I couldn't comprehend what I just seen. I did some research and discovered it was a shadow person, and I have seen it a few times since then. The strange thing is, it has never scared me. It has not spoken to me since. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. I worked on the 3700 block of Las Vegas Boulevard for about 4.5 years. I didn't work for the casino itself, but a third-party vendor. We faced the fountains. Vegas always tears down and builds again. There really isn't anything old in the city, but that does not mean once it's gone forever. After about a month of working, I noticed that I'd always see the back of a woman's head. She was blonde, about 5'5". She wasn't really there. I'd always catch just a glimpse of her and then she'd be gone. Funny thing is, she was shopping in the women's section of the store. I'd tell any co-worker who'd listen to me, but was always brushed off as the weird guy who talked about the paranormal. This location was the biggest in the shopping area, about 1,500 square feet of shopping space, plus an additional 1,100 square feet of stock rooms where merchandise was kept. The stock rooms were split into 4 different sections. Each section had its own door separating it from the others. In one of the sections that was the farthest from the sales floor, that we called the shoe room, everyone would get a creepy feeling and try to spend the least amount of time back there. I didn't mind it because it was a quiet area and one could hide out from management. Quarterly, I worked overnight shifts to reset the floor and make sure all new pieces were showcased. I worked these shifts frequently. It was nice seeing the city empty and lit by all the lights. Every shift went on, and no reports of anything strange occurring. Then it happened, out of nowhere and totally unexpected. During this particular shift, it was only the visual manager and myself working for a few hours. It was around 2:30 a.m. I was in the shoe room, about 7 feet up on the ladder, grabbing some shelving, singing to myself. I heard my name being called. Johann, Johann. I called out, "What?" However, I had no response. I was thinking since I heard my name being called that the manager was in the stockroom nearby. I called out again, but heard nothing in return. I walked out to the floor and called out, "What?" one more time. I then saw the manager walk from the other side of the store, asking what I wanted. I was a little confused because she was the one asking. She heard her name being called out while I was in the shoe room at the same time. A heavy air fell over the sales floor once we both realized that none of us were calling out to each other. A few months later, we had to downsize the location. Knowing that the women's side and the shoe room were going to a new restaurant coming was a relief to me. Knowing that was most of the paranormal areas were not going to be included in the new location, I was grateful. Story 2. I was always sensitive when I was younger. I knew that we were surrounded by spirits and could sense when they were near. My high school was situated near an old one-room schoolhouse that had been closed for somewhat around 50 years. The stories I was able to gather from the older inhabitants of the town were that there were strange happenings in the school, and a small group of the younger students were found dead in the schoolroom one morning when the school marm opened the building for the day. Intrigued, I went to investigate. The doors and windows were boarded up after years of vandalism. I heard the giggling of young children from inside this condemned building, and then the patter of running feet. Shortly after this, I began to hear these sounds in the halls of my high school when I was alone. There were very few times I felt they were malevolent, but they did keep the malevolent spirits that walked the halls of our school at bay. Of course, I have many other stories. The town where I spent most of my youth was filled with these haunted places, but what happens in the desert stays in the desert. I lived in a house where we could hear old radio stations played at odd hours of the night and day, and a young woman with long hair walked the halls of our home. She looked vaguely like my mother, who had killed herself when I was 12. She had long brownish hair that she would stand near the heater and brush in the early mornings most days. She would move things around and be a general nuisance, but she never did anything overtly evil or mean to me. Story 3. I was a young girl, maybe 9, 10 years old. I had been going to this elementary school in Las Vegas where we had a small fundraising carnival going on. My father had taken us to make up for not seeing us for almost a month. My little sister and I were all over the place having fun and playing the games when I got this retching feeling in my gut. It felt like a vortex swallowing me up from the inside out, and all I wanted to do was lay down. I stood frozen, trying to gather my bearings. My father didn't notice. He was looking for my sister, who had gone to participate in the cake dance game. But I was standing in the middle of a large crowd, frozen, yet aware of my surroundings, when my vision began to blur and darken. I tried to look around as if someone could help, but then I saw a figure in front of me of a woman. She looked as if she had been crying at first, but then she smiled at me and waved goodbye and then disappeared. The feeling that had me frozen left me instantly, and I could see my father running up to me with his phone pressed against his ear, saying, "We need to go now." We got into the car and drove to my grandmother's house, where my grandfather had been sitting on the porch crying, as my dad ran inside. Grandpa walked to the car and sat in the back seat. I asked him what happened as soon as he closed the door. He simply looked at me and said with a familiar face of tears rolling down his cheeks, "Now you're going to need to give your daddy some time." Me too. "What happened, Grandpa?" I asked, and it was then he just told me that my grandmother Mary had passed away. I didn't know what it had meant, but I didn't cry, even though she was my favorite person in the world. But I'd felt that I had been given closure from the spirit I had seen at the carnival, who, now that I think about it, looked a lot like my grandmother, only younger. Story 4. At the time that this story came into place, I was only a baby, so really this is from my mother's experience. Whenever I ask my mom if she's ever had any paranormal encounters, she always brings up this memory. Her first encounter was when my father was at work, and it was just her and me in their bed in the middle of the day. Later in the day, she heard the kitchen cabinets downstairs open and close in a slow pattern. She would listen closely and then say, "Hi, Grandma." She explains that she never felt scared or threatened because she knew it was her. She knew because her grandmother was closest to her, and still was after death. Sometimes she would randomly wake up around 2 or 3 a.m. after she felt a light rub on her chest like her grandmother was waking her up. Unfortunately, as I got older and my mom and my younger brother, my mom stopped having any activity, which made me feel sad because I've been wanting to come upon a friendly spirit of my own out of dangerous curiosity. I tell my parents this all the time, and they tell me to never mess with spirits because I never know what I'm getting myself into. My mom, who somewhat believes in all things spiritual, tells me I could only and should only communicate when you need them to leave you alone or to guide them into their own realm where they're supposed to be, which I'm not sure if I believe in that. Story 5. Even to this day, I still find this experience to be the strangest thing I've ever experienced. I don't remember how old I was, but I was pretty young. I don't remember many things from this, but my mother described me as always being scared, looking around as if something was there, and feeling a dark presence around me. From what I remember, this all started when my mother was making me read the Bible. Being a little kid, I thought reading the Bible was boring. The one thing that was weird is that every time I would read, I would get extremely sleepy. After reading a few words, I would start to get tired. My mother said it was the devil keeping me from reading. I really didn't believe her since I thought it was crazy for that to be happening. And the next thing I can remember was that strange things began happening. I don't recall sleepwalking or the things that I did while in that state, but the things my family said frightened me. I remember them sharing the things they had seen me do. Our apartment at that time was small. It had only 2 bedrooms. In one room, all 7 of my family members slept in that one room. The other one was for my cousin who was staying with us at the time. My mother told me to get up. I would get up out of bed, stand in the corner of the room and watch everyone sleep, sometimes stand right in front of them. My older brother said he would see me walk around, look out the window, open the door to the room as if to see someone on the other side. He said I would face the walls and talk with someone. I don't recall any of that, but what I do remember is the many dreams that I had during that time. I had dreams of my family's doppelgangers. There were only 2 dreams that I can fully remember. One about my younger brother and the one about my older sister. In the dreams, I would be with the particular family member that their doppelganger would appear and come after me, but the dreams would end right after they attacked. The one I had about my younger brother was the one that scared me the most. I never told anyone about these dreams as I didn't want to frighten them anymore. The sleepwalking only got worse later on. I was starting to physically hurt myself and doing inappropriate things. My mother said I stopped talking and being more frightened as if something was tormenting me, something we cannot see. I was literally going insane. My mother could not longer bear to see me in such a state, so my parents contacted the church and arranged for me to be blessed. I remember going to the church, standing in front of a large crowd. The priest said prayers and sprinkled holy water on me. After the ceremony, everything stopped. The sleepwalking, the dreams, my odd behavior, everything had returned to normal. My older sister described it as the light finally touching me. The dark cloud had been lifted. The entire experience was pretty frightening, and I still can't wrap my head around it. Even with my family's testimonies, I guess I'll never know what was really happening. Story 6. It was the year 1968. My mom had a little girl. Her name was Linda. It was only me and my older sister, which was 6. I was 5. We lived in the projects, old government apartments. Baby Linda was 2. It was on Saturday night around 10 p.m. Me and my sister share a bedroom. We had 2 twin beds. My bed was near the bedroom door. My sister's bed was across from mine. Anyway, we live in a 2-bedroom apartment. My stepdad worked graveyard shift. My mom was a housewife. As I was saying, we always kept the bathroom light on near the hallway. As I laid across the bed trying to fall asleep, I was looking out into the hallway. I noticed a little figure crawling. I stood half up and speak out, "Linda, come to bed, it's late." She crawled near my bedroom door and then stood up, walking slowly. I quickly got up and said, "Hurry up, you're going to get me in trouble, come to bed." She'd gotten halfway in. I was about to get up out of bed and drag her. Before I could start, she started walking backwards, got into the hallway, then right before my eyes disappeared. That's what I said, she disappeared, vanished right before my very eyes. I quickly jumped out of my bed, ran to my sister's bed, but there in the bed was my baby sister Linda. So tell me, what the hell did I see, and what did I talk to? It wasn't my baby Linda. I squeezed between them both, afraid, my heart beating so fast. Covers over my head, I could hear dragging footsteps around the bed. I was absolutely terrified. I think the little sister that I saw wasn't my little sister in the bed, but one that died before I was born. Story 7. When I was 14, I lived in the country about 20 miles outside of a small town. I loved it. One night I was in the bed on the verge of sleep. I don't know what time it was, late enough for my family to all be asleep. Well, I was almost asleep when out of nowhere I hear this man's voice say, "1." It was loud and deep. It didn't stop at 1. It started counting. I was startled, completely awake, and I was looking around to find the source of the counting. The layout of my room, I should point out, my bed was next to the wall by the window, and at the foot of my bed was my walk-in closet. At the far wall of my closet was a dresser. When I looked down my body and into the closet, I saw a small black shape sitting on my dresser with red eyes. I could clearly see the shape and arms and legs, which they were swinging back and forth like a child would do sitting on a chair too big for them. When I saw the thing, I froze in absolute terror. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. Believe me, I tried many times. The third time this thing reached the end of its counting, it put its hands on the edge of the dresser and pushed off and landed on the floor. I prayed the hardest I've ever prayed in my life and was able to finally move and ran like there was no tomorrow out of my room into my sister's room. I climbed into bed with her and cried my eyes out. To this day, I have no idea what that thing was or what it wanted. I have never been able to sleep with the closet door open since. It's been almost 20 years and I'm still scared by it. That was the first experience and the worst, but since that day, I've had many, many more. Some in that house which we built, and then in every place I've ever lived. Has anyone else had an experience like this, or any idea what it could have been? I'd love to know. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. In 1985, I was 17 and dating a girl in Valparaiso, Indiana. Her dad and I became close, and we were both Bears fans at the best time you could be one. I was there late one night in December after a game, and my girlfriend, mother, and sisters went to bed. It was about 2 a.m. when we heard the banging outside. He said, "Want to see something?" We got bundled up and treaded outside in the knee-high snow. They lived outside town in a rural setting with a field across the road and just a few houses on their side. We went around the house, and I could see light in their neighbor's shed. Shadows were flashing around through the light, and you could tell the bulb was swinging. The shed had windows in each door and opened barn style. As we got closer, I could see tools flying around the room and banging against the walls. I looked at him. "Hey, what the hell is that?" He said, "I've seen this twice. Watch." When we got up to the doors, he reached up to grab the handle and looked at me just before he grasped it. He said, "Wait," then grabbed the handle. It was like a plug was pulled. Light went out and everything stopped. All you could hear was the wind. He said, "Show's over." We walked back silently. I went into the service a few months later and never saw him again. We never talked about it. Not once. 20 years later, I ran into my ex-girlfriend and told her that story. She said he never told her that. She called him while I was sitting there, and he said, "Oh yeah, that was something all right." She just shrugged her shoulders and said, "Ain't that just like him?" I guess I won't get him to back my story up. Story 2. So a little background. My room is always cold, but we just blamed it on the fact that I only have one vent leading to my room. But now that I think about it, I believe that's not the reason. I've always had an overactive imagination, so when it comes to seeing things, my parents dismiss it, saying it's all in my head. But last night I caught something on camera. I had this strange feeling that something or someone was watching me from above. I ignored it for a bit, but then it got to a point where I could not fall asleep. So I turned on my camera and started recording my ceiling. I have 8-foot ceilings because I live in the garage that was remodeled into 2 bedrooms. After a little bit, I stopped the recording and looked over the video, and there right above me was a white face. I instantly turned on my light, but there was nothing there that could have created the face I saw. I decided to sleep in a different room so that I would not be bothered, but today, while I was cleaning my room, I would feel someone tapping my shoulder or poking my back. I knew I was alone in my room because I was facing my door, so no one would have walked in behind me without me knowing. I dismissed the taps until I started hearing coughs or sneezes behind me. This is not the first time I've felt that something was with me when I was alone, but this was the first time I knew something was there. I'm too scared to sleep in my room tonight and fear that things might escalate, and I don't know if the entity is attached to the room or me. Story 3. I have had some paranormal activity since I purchased my home in 2015, but lately it has gotten more active, but only during the night. Some nights I am awakened by a voice saying things that I cannot understand, but a couple of weeks ago the voice said plainly, "I want milk." I turned the light on and answered, but got no response. I went back to sleep and was awakened by the sound of feet running fast by the recliner I was sleeping in. I could even feel a cold breeze on my face from the movement. I recently purchased a voice-activated recorder, but do not seem to have any activity when this is on. Last night, I was in my bed reading a book when I, all at once, got the feeling that something was staring at me. Looked around, but could not see anything. Read a few more minutes, put the book down on the bed, put my glasses on top of the book, turned off the light, and within seconds, heard and felt something punch the book. I turned the light back on, and my glasses were laying on the floor. Over the years, I've experienced a lot of cabinet and closet doors opening and closing, and other noises during the night. I so far have not actually felt fear, and believe that whatever it is just being mischievous and poses no real danger, but I could be wrong. This is not my first experience with a house with paranormal activity. I sold that property and got rid of it, and later the people that purchased it asked me if we had any kind of activity while we lived there, and I told them that I have, but was not sure. I sure would like to know how to get rid of what I'm experiencing here now, though. Story 4. Today, February 8, 2020, at approximately 1:45 p.m., my husband and I were heading to the cemetery to visit my younger sister who passed away at age 38. Today made 2 years, and we were meeting my family to visit her. Weird things have been happening, like my husband's toothbrush being thrown twice in the shower. Weird, I know, but today on our way to the radio station kept changing on us as we were driving. We have a newer vehicle, so no issues with it. It has never happened before. I've been really depressed the last few weeks, knowing this terrible anniversary was coming up. I was anxious, afraid to go. It makes it too real to see her headstone. I wonder if it's her. I find dimes and pennies, see shadows. Hubby's toothbrush gets thrown in the shower. I think about her daily. I miss her so much. So much was left unsaid when she passed. I'm not sure if this is real, meaning I'm kind of freaked out, and so is my husband. I want to see her so bad. I want to talk to her. Sometimes I feel someone rubbing my side when I'm in bed, when I'm sad. I know it isn't my husband. He sleeps in a separate room because of his CPAP machine. Is she visiting me? Or could it be my own energy doing this? I wish I could communicate with her. I wish I knew who this is. If she's trying to get my attention, if it's her or another family member. I know this stuff seems small, but this is new to us. My husband's brother also passed recently. His was due to his wife's neglects. It could have been prevented. We tried getting guardianship of him, but lost. He was 57. My sister passed from cancer. She was 38 with a 5-year-old and an 8-month-old. Thanks for letting me share my small story. Story 5. I have multiple ghosts in my home. They have been with me my entire life. I'm used to them. Just recently, I thought there was a new ghost in my family's home, but soon I figured out it was a poltergeist. Me and my sister like naming our ghosts so we can tell which ghost is currently with us. Before you say something about how you can't see ghosts, so how do you know which ghost or ghost is with you? Certain ghosts normally just hang out in a certain room. I named the poltergeist Timmy. He's only ever in the kitchen. Timmy acts like a 6-year-old little boy. I say this because he likes opening and closing the cabinets. Whenever we are about to go on vacation or a trip, Timmy throws a tantrum. Timmy never hurts anyone, so we are comfortable being in the same room as him. Whenever Timmy first showed up, I personally didn't know what to think. I just thought it was another ghost or one of our already present ghosts that decided to hang out in the kitchen. Timmy has only been here for about 2 months and hasn't caused that much trouble, except for not letting anyone sleep. He's very active at night. For people that say I need to get rid of the ghosts, trust me, I tried, but it didn't work. The ghosts that are currently in my home are the only ones I let in because they don't cause trouble. Story 6. I joined the Army fresh out of high school, and since then lived in dozens of places, and this has happened only one place. Huntertown, Indiana. I was living in a 2-story townhouse, lived alone. Well, at night, from time to time, I could feel something petting me, more like stroking my back, my neck, down my back. Always my neck and down my back. And whatever was touching me so hard I would wake up. I thought it was a serial killer that broke in and was petting me so it could savor the moment before they made their killing. I would wake up, would open my eyes, but would lay very still to see if I could still feel it, and I knew I wasn't dreaming. I would flip over real fast and there was nothing there. This happened several times. The touch was cold and made my body tingle wherever it touched me. I eventually spoke to my mom and stepdad about things, and my friends, and they all thought I was dreaming, but I knew I wasn't. Well, one night, it happened again, and this time, as soon as I woke up, I flipped over, and there was a man standing there next to my bed. He was there, just standing there. I couldn't make out his features, but his frame in the moonlight was unmistakable, so I let out this spine-chilling scream that woke the neighbors. I jumped out of bed and started swinging on this guy with both hands and everything I had, screaming at him. But the thing was, my hands just went through him. After several swings, I stopped and just looked. The guy did the same thing the whole time. He just slowly slipped towards the wall. Once he reached it, he just faded into the wall and the floor. He was made of what appeared to be smoke, ash, and light. The whole time, he just moved through my punches and just kept moving until I stopped. Slowly, without concern. After that, I slept on the couch, or I had company come over more often, but I don't remember it touching me ever again. This is a 100% true story. I don't want anything for it, I just want to tell it. Story 7. Growing up in my aunt's house was absolute torture. We had to move out of my grandma's house and into her house because it was closer to a better school for me and my brother. It was my 10th birthday when the activity started. I was having a sleepover with my friend, and it was around 4 in the morning. She looked up, then turned pale white. I asked her what was wrong, and she pointed at the wall. I looked up and saw, as clear as day, a shadow person. It was completely black. When I looked up at it, it just turned around and walked away. I ran down the hall and woke up my dad and told him what happened, but he just laughed it off, saying we were tired, which I believed for a while. Then I started thinking, if we were both tired, would we have seen the same thing? I didn't know if that was it at the time, but not even a month later I got my answer. It was real. It was the middle of the night, and I had the weirdest nightmare that I don't really remember, but when I woke up, it was a yellow figure on top of me. It was huddled on top of me, holding my arms and legs down. It turned its head and slowly evaporated. Every night until we moved, since that night, there was something behind the bedroom door. I used to sleep with the hall light on and the door open. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to a thing I can only describe as darkness peeking at me from behind the door, like going out and in like it was scared. One morning I woke up on a Saturday. My brother and I shared a bedroom at the time. My brother had already woken up, and I saw a little boy sleeping on my brother's bed. I just left the room and let the little boy sleep there. It was another night where I was sitting on the couch reading a book, and I'm not joking, heard an evil laugh. It sounded like my dad slightly, so I looked up thinking he was home playing a joke. When I did, a shadow man floated through my legs and into the wall. I stared at the wall trying to find it. For a few minutes I couldn't walk. It was around 11. I was playing with my toys and I saw the shadow of my dad coming down the hall laughing. It was him. It was shaped like him and the laugh was his. I heard him snoring in his room at the same time. One day, me and my brother were going to scare my mom when she came home from work with Nerf guns, and I saw the shadow walk down the hall behind him. To this day, when I visit my aunt's house, I won't go into the hall after dark. Story 8. I have just moved into Logansport, Indiana. This is the place where my mother and grandfather both grew up. We also moved into the house that they both grew up in, which it has, of course, been fixed up. I have had many other sightings, but this is the most recent one and the most terrifying. I am 16, so of course I like to be out at night, even just in my backyard. I have recently noticed a figure standing outside of the fence surrounding our yard. My first thought was a person trying to scare me, so I ran into the house and told my mother while grabbing a baseball bat just in case. We both ran out and no one was there. We then went back inside and called the police just in case. The next time I saw it was about 2 weeks after that encounter. I was in my room trying to sleep when I turned and saw the cloaked figure standing in the corner. Only this time the eyes were a deep red, almost like the shade of blood but glowing lightly. I couldn't move once I saw the eyes. I couldn't scream or do anything. Then there was a low whisper that I couldn't make out, and when I asked what it wanted, it responded with, "May God have mercy on your soul." It was so loud I couldn't bear it and started screaming. No one else heard it but me. That morning, I noticed scratches on my stomach in the form of 3 lines. I am still terrified to this day and haven't seen it again. This is now 3 weeks after the incident, but I have noticed my mood has never been the same. I constantly feel as if I'm being followed. I've been seeing others more recently. When I see someone and I tell my mother about it, she tells me she doesn't know what I'm talking about. I hear the voices of many in my head. I simply cannot escape, for I do not believe in priests. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. It started on August 15th. I felt like someone was watching me, which is not unusual in my home. It is active with a very specific spirit who I believe to be an owner of the house and is very particular of how he likes things arranged and moved around the house without malice or intent. My home was built in the 1920s. The new spirit or spirits is different. At first it was just a glimpse of white eyes peeking through a window. The following morning I measured, and they would have been 5 feet for their eyes to line up with the edge of the window. I checked for footprints and any sign of disturbance, as they would have had to been standing in my garden. On the evening of the 16th, my dog went and sat in the window and stared at these eyes for about 30 seconds before they blinked a few times and went away. This pattern followed for a few nights, at different times in the evening, in different windows. Every time I locked eyes with one, I felt overwhelming sorrow and sympathy. They don't feel threatening. This happened for a few nights. The evening of the 18th, I took some photos in my bedroom because I felt like I was being watched. I caught a photo of these eyes standing at about 4 or 3 feet right inside my doorway. Once again, I did not feel threatened, but more confused on how or why they had moved into my home. The next morning of the 19th, I spoke to a friend about it, as I had captured photos. She was very pessimistic about what the spirit could be and expressed her concern. She thinks the eyes are too far apart to be human. She thinks an animal's spirit, but cannot explain the height. The evening of the 19th, there are 2 sets of eyes outside my window. Another set in the spare bedroom at 3 feet looking at me, making 3 visible pairs of eyes at this one time. I smudged the house this morning, hoping to push them outside. At 10 p.m., when I made this account to share my story and ask if anyone else has a similar experience, there are 5 pairs of eyes visible at one time, 1 pair inside the kitchen and 4 in the windows. I'm not frightened by them, but confused on why their activity grew exponentially over the course of 5 days. I tried to contact them, speak to them, and ask them what is wrong, and they continue just to stare and blink. They never stay more than 45 seconds or a minute. I only see them once an evening, excluding the pair I saw in my bedroom. Story 2. To be honest, I do not know that this is paranormal in any way, but it's been going on for so long now and so consistently, and has been produced 1 or 2 rather terrifying incidents that I'm wondering if it is more than just a 3-year-old imagination. My youngest son, the only one that lives with my ex-wife and I, has been saying that he sees a bird or birds in his room at night for about the last 1.5 or 2 years now. We recently moved from one end of town to another, and on the night the move started, the worst experience of all happened. My wife and I were woken from a dead sleep by my son screaming bloody murder. I can't remember offhand right now exactly what he said, but when we asked him what was wrong, I remember him mentioning the bird above his bed. There was and is nothing above his bed. I have placed a guardian angel and a blessed icon of St. Anne and Our Lady above his bed. This seems to have mitigated things, but he still sees this bird. We thought that it might be the fact that our old apartment was built above an old municipal pool, but the building we live in now was finished last August 2014. I still can't dismiss the fact that both my wife and I are currently full-time students, and this may be a way for him to get our attention, but that would suggest to me that he would be doing this every night. He is not. He also had little to no trouble sleeping a few weeks ago due to being sick, well, except the night he woke up 3 or 4 times to throw up. Has anyone else had this happen to their child? And if so, what have you done about it? Story 3. I was truly never a spiritually inclined child, but to be honest, I can't really say otherwise, being I have very few memories from my childhood. About 8 years ago, my father moved to a remote area in Wyoming. What area in Wyoming is not remote? I don't know. And I have lived there ever since. After about 3 of those 8 years had passed by, he acquired a new job at a private estate at the foot of a large, uncut forest. The owners of this private estate are absent for 10 months out of the year, leaving 6 log cabins and 3 mansions behind them to live in an even larger estate in Texas. I tell you one thing, nothing is creepier than those mansions at midnight. They are adorned with every Native American or Inuit statue that you can possibly think of, not to mention the overabundance of small rooms, cupboards, and even cabinets that opened into mirrors. My family is known for its variety. My uncle supposedly saw an Indian spirit up on a mountain not far from there. He had a history of that, and a history of mental illness in his side of the family, so no one ever believed him, despite what he said. That is, until I was 12. My father let us play in the mansions when the masters were gone for the long time, and he trusted me with being careful of all the expensive paintings and some dull weapons that definitely would be of no use at all in any situation. I was a kid, and kids do tend to make imaginary friends. Not that night, but my young friend and I were infamous for upturning every small opening in an unknown area. And that we did that night when the adults were staying in a house not more than 100 yards away. When you are 12-ish, tired and completely warm and snug in your bed, and are used to the lights turned off, you don't notice the things like footsteps and lights turning on and off. The pinball machine was in action, and my friend Sarah was sipping on her pop when we both get the classic hair standing up on the back of our necks. Then the lights flash off, creaks resonate through the house, and we feel completely unsafe. Like at any moment, the statues on the walls would peel off and turn their heads to look at us. We abandoned our pops and ran for the closest corner we could find. A small room with an enclosed door was in our sight, and we ran for it. But inside, the lights were on, and a reflection shone lightly off the tan-colored window shades. Yes, the varnish shades shone the reflection of a man in a light brown-colored clothing. We ran for it. The day after, while all the lights were on in the middle of the day, Sarah and I finally made it to the basement and were promptly finding cupboards to open. Seconds later, I hear a scream. Running over to assist Sarah, I see the same sight, an obsidian knife decorated with a red feather plume hitting the ground. We slammed the door shut and ran, but when we returned, it was gone. I tried to avoid that house for a couple of years. I never told my parents, but rather kept the experience to myself. Then 1 or 2 years ago, oddly enough, the daughter or son of the owners had actually had an exorcism performed that year due to their own suspicions of a visit from the dead. The strange thing is, the house was only about 9 years old, but hey, we have had our share of deaths in that area, by hunting accident or bears, etc. Just goes to show you anything can happen. Maybe my uncle wasn't as crazy as we thought. Story 4. Every year when I was a kid, my family, Dad, Mom, me, and little sister, went to Wyoming to see our friends. They lived in a farmhouse with a huge yard and a ranch, so I loved going there. The only thing that freaked me out was its history. Their house was 200 years old and had a graveyard in their property. They had so many stories of seeing things, figures showing up in pictures, and hearing talking, laughing, singing, etc. In the graveyard there were a few children, so I think they have something to do with this story. My sister, my friend Grace, and I were sitting on the back porch talking. They had a big wrap around the porch, and we were sitting on the corner. It was a hot day with very little if no breeze. We were eating ice creams as we were talking when the back door suddenly flew open and started opening and closing really fast. The opening was facing us, and there was no hand. By the way it was moving, it would be impossible for the wind to be doing this, even if it was a very windy day, but there was no wind at all. We stared at it in shock for a couple of seconds, then screamed, dropped our ice creams, and ran around to the front where everyone was there. No one was missing. That same day, the three of us were sitting in the same spot talking about ghosts. Grace was saying how she could tell when they were near. Me and my sister just looked at each other thinking, yeah, right. Grace went to take a drink. She saw there was a bug in the drink. She put down her glass and said, ew, there's a bug in here. Then suddenly the glass flew off the deck as if something had pushed. Again, the way it had done, it was impossible to have been the wind. Our prediction was that it was one of the ghost kids playing a prank on us. We don't know what it was, but that's all we think it was, and we know it wasn't the wind. Story 5. I've always been receptive to spirits since as long as I can remember. I also sometimes dream of them and dream of things that have happened or are going to happen, but in no way do I consider myself psychic. Here's one experience that might creep you out, and I'm curious about other people's conclusions. When I was 5 years old, my dad took my two brothers and me on a road trip shortly after he and my mom divorced. We'd often drive for long hours without stopping, touring sites until we grew tired and stopped to camp. Since my dad wasn't exactly the richest man in the world at the time, he'd find places for us to camp where there were no camping fees. Sometimes we'd have to forego public camping sites altogether and drive down lonely dirt roads secluded from the highway. This was one such occasion. Near the base of the Beartooth Mountains, he drove his truck many miles down a dirt road, passing a ranch holding roaming buffalo within. Finally, he found the spot where he wanted us to place up for the night, nestled within the pine trees. We set up the camp, roasted hot dogs, and finally went to bed. I was walking through the forest. It was day. I was alone. I noticed that the trees were tall and thin, and not pine trees. There wasn't any undergrowth, just the soft ground. And then I stopped. I was staring at one very large, flat rock buried beneath the dirt, only the top surface of it exposed. Noticing this, I looked up to see a tall, pale woman with long, dark hair wearing a stained white dress, like a nightgown, standing several feet in front of me. She was talking, or at least I could see her mouth moving, but no sound or words came out. I asked her if she was okay, but as soon as I did, she began screaming. It was one long, drawn-out, high-pitched scream that never seemed to end. She never moved away from the rock, pointing at it. My dad woke me up. It was the morning, and we were already running behind. He needed to fix breakfast for us fast, so he asked me and my brothers to collect firewood to help him get started. I ran behind my brothers, who ran deeper and deeper into the forest. We ran into an area where there wasn't any underbrush. No good, because there weren't any sticks on the ground either. They ran on, but I didn't follow them. I stopped because I was in the same place as my dream the night before. I'd already seen the large, flat, moss-covered rock in front of me. Suddenly, I realized I was alone. Terrified that the screaming woman would appear, I hightailed it out of there and returned to my dad, waiting for my brothers to return. The dream has stuck in my mind ever since. Story 6. In September of 2005, I was transferred for work to Riverton, Wyoming. I found a nice little two-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a small apartment complex. I got everything unpacked and set up just how I wanted it. I never felt quite comfortable in the apartment, but I just figured it was because it was my first time being away from home and living by myself. I had many strange things happen in the apartment, like the lights or TV being off when I knew I'd turned them on, but I just ignored them. I continued to tell myself it was all in my head. I would pass the time by going to coworkers' houses or talking on the phone to my friends and family. Finally, something happened. One night in November 2005 caused me to no longer be able to ignore all the strange happenings in the apartment. I had my room set up with my bed under a window in the middle of the room, with my dresser on one side and my vanity on the other side. There was a ceiling fan above my bed that I always used to pull at the string and turn the light on and off, so I did not have to walk across the room in the dark to get into bed. I went to bed around 10 o'clock that night. I fell asleep easily that night and did not wake up until around 3 a.m. when I woke up to a girl sitting on the stand in front of my vanity. She was young, probably around 20. She had very long black hair and was wearing a long white nightgown. When I woke up, she turned around and said her name was Emily Bombarton. I'm not sure of the spelling on the last name, but that is how it sounded, and this was her room. I freaked out and started to scream, jumped up on my bed and pulled the chain on the light, and then she was gone. I saw Emily one more time about a month later. I'd gotten two cats to help me not feel so alone and uncomfortable at home. I was woken up at 3 a.m. by my cats freaking out. When I opened my eyes, I saw Emily hovering over top of me. I could not move or scream. I just stared at her. After what seemed to be an hour, but I'm sure it was just a few seconds she vanished. After the second time I had a run-in with Emily, I could no longer live in that apartment. I found a new place to live and moved out. I have not seen her since. I asked around to see if anyone knew anything about my apartment or that name. No one had any idea why these things had happened. I sometimes wonder about what caused Emily to become a ghost and why she made herself known to me. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. I would like to take a moment to point out that a majority of my viewers are not subscribed. If you could be so kind as to subscribe, click like, leave a comment, maybe even share the video, it will go a long way in helping me get recommended. And if you would like to join my Patreon, you'll find a link in the description below. For $5 a month, you'll have access to all my content before it goes to YouTube. That goes for stories and my newest edition, short episodes of my mini haunting series. Now, let's get back to the stories. Story 1. I was 7 years old and just about to go into the first grade. We had just moved and I knew no one. When I was younger, I was obsessed with dolls. For my 6th birthday, my grandma had gifted me a doll she had found at Goodwill. This doll was old. They no longer make dolls like her anymore, and I was thrilled. I would be the only one with this doll, and I already loved her. I named her Jamie, and I took her everywhere. I started noticing weird things about 3 months after I received Jamie. When I would be playing with her, I would hear the voices of people that weren't there. As a young child, I mostly ignored the voices and continued playing. These occurrences stopped for a couple of months and came back in full force about a month after my 7th birthday. I met a girl named Leah, changed her name for privacy reasons, and invited her over to play. We had an extra room at that time because my mom was pregnant with my would-be second little brother. The room was set up as a nursery and was perfect for a playing house. Both Leah and I agreed that Jamie would be the oldest child, and a few of my younger dolls would be Jamie's younger siblings. Leah thought it would be fun to put Jamie in timeout for hitting her sister. I agreed. We set Jamie in the crib facing the wall, grabbed both the other dolls, left the room, and closed the door behind us. We waited for a few minutes and re-entered the room. Jamie was now sitting in the exact same place, but facing the door. Both Leah and I fled, leaving Jamie where she was, refusing to re-enter the room. At that year's garage sale, we sold the doll to an antique owner, who promised to take good care of her. It still haunts me to this day, and I will never truly understand how it happened. The only other people in the house that day were my dad and my younger brother, who were in the basement when it happened. We were standing outside the door, so no one could have entered the room. Story 2. This took place in the mid-80s, when I was 11 or 12. My mom was an art teacher back then, and my best friend's mom was an artist, so there were a lot of artsy things floating around our two households. Cracked pottery, sculptures, fancy drapes, costume jewelry, you name it. But the one that took the cake was a real human skull that my friend's mom used for a sketching model. How she came to own it was unclear to me. I do know that it wasn't a deceased family member. The first incident took place on an extremely cold evening in January. My friend invited several of us over to her place to hang out. The reason I mentioned the cold is because she had dark thermal drapes in her room. The drapes kept out the chill, but they also blocked out streetlights, headlights, and whatever natural light was left that day. We decided not to turn on the inside lights and lit a couple of candles instead. After playing a few rounds of cards, one of us had the bright idea that we should try summon spirits. We had no idea what we were doing, but we wanted to make it a glamorous affair by decorating my friend's dresser with offerings. The dresser had a huge trifold mirror on top. We draped some sparkly necklaces and scarves around the mirror, put some jewelry boxes in front of it, set the candles in front of the mirror, spread out a deck of cards, and, you guessed it, placed the skull in the middle of this arrangement. Then we huddled on my friend's bed and waited. None of us knew how to summon spirits, so we just sat there waiting for something to happen. I had some misgivings about using the skull, but went along with the scheme thinking that it was harmless enough. Since I was a little scared, I didn't look at the dresser, but focused my attention on the dark corner shielded from all the light by a huge old-fashioned wardrobe. The corner was very dark. Suddenly a faint circular light appeared there, started to grow. Strangely enough, it did not scare me. I just sat there and watched it get bigger. It felt like a long time, but I doubt that this lasted longer than a few seconds. Suddenly the bedroom door flew open, and my friend's 3-year-old brother burst into the room, banging pot lids together and offering to fry us an egg. The light from the hallway poured into the dark bedroom, and the faint circle of light disappeared. I asked my friends later if any of them saw anything. They said they didn't, but they were looking at the dresser and the mirror. I was the only one who was too scared to look at the centerpiece. I tried to convince myself afterwards that what I saw was perfectly natural. Perhaps it was a ray of light that preceded the opening of the bedroom door, I argued. Unfortunately, no explanation seemed completely adequate. Light from the door would have started as a linear streak, not a circle. Maybe darkness messed with my vision, but then again, perhaps we were all saved from the massive scare, or worse, by a 3-year-old chef. The following fall, my mom borrowed the skull for sketching. For a few weeks it sat in the middle of our fancy dining room table, the kind that only gets used at Christmas. As I didn't have to see the skull at night, I wasn't particularly scared of it, but generally preferred to steer clear. Several weeks into the skull's temporary residency, my mom called me into the dining room and asked me to bring a duffel bag. She seemed very concerned about something. When I arrived with the bag, she loaded the skull into the bag, told me not to touch the skull, and asked me to take it back to my friend's house as soon as possible. I was really spooked at that point and ran rather quickly to my friend's place. When I got back, my mom breathed a sigh of relief and told me that she thought the skull had really bad energy. A few weeks later, she explained that after she brought the skull home, all kinds of little things started going wrong. Nothing really serious, just annoying little things. She didn't elaborate, but said that as soon as the skull left, everything went back to normal. Story 3. When I was in my early teens, I used to spend a few weeks each summer at my grandma's farmhouse out in the country. The house was very old, complete with a root cellar under the kitchen and a rickety staircase. The front part of the house was bright and airy and happy, but the back part was gloomy and creepy. We mostly used the back for storage and rarely went there. The house didn't generally have bad vibes, but I felt like the heavy front part of the house was besieged by darkness lingering in the back and in the creepy root cellar underneath. I was never 100% comfortable there. One time my grandma was out grocery shopping or visiting a friend, and I was left alone in the house. There weren't many kids my age in this tiny town, and I mostly had to fend for myself for entertainment. TV reception was terrible. This was back in the 80s, so I spent most of my time walking, reading, and doing crafts. To break the monotony, I thought it would be a fun experiment with a Ouija board. I didn't have one on hand, and since I was alone, I didn't think it would work anyway. Then I recalled that a friend once told me that instead of a Ouija, I could use a needle suspended over the alphabet drawn around a circle. The needle would supposedly move and point to letters in response to questions. It didn't sound very legit, but I was bored and decided to try it. I drew letters around a circle and suspended a needle on a thread over it. The needle settled, pointing to the center of the circle. Thank you, gravity. It did not move again, but I wasn't going to give up that easily. I figured that if I rested the point of the needle in the center and tilted the needle a little by lowering its top, I could get the top to spin around while the tip remained anchored in the center. Then the top was bound to settle, pointing to a letter. This time I had the laws of physics on my side, so the needle did indeed point to different letters each time I gave it a whirl. I'm sure I started with some silly questions about which boys liked me, and I'm sure I got some gibberish answers. It wasn't really working. I was ready to give up, but decided to ask what my profession will be when I grow up. The needle finally spelled the word, shoe. This freaked me out. I ran out of the house and sat in the yard until my grandma returned. Once back from summer break, I told my friends about what had happened. We had a good laugh about me becoming a shoe. Several years went by and I'd forgotten about the incident entirely. It all came back though when I found myself working in the shoe department at a large store. Story 4. It took me over 40 years to write this account with a calm and analytical frame of mind. Initially, every time my husband and I tried to write about it, we'd get rattled and discontinue it. We wanted to send this account to a well-known parapsychologist, Hans Holzer, to add to his files, but we never got around to it. I assume if you're reading this that you're a believer, so here goes. One of the most powerful experiences happened in my mid to late 20s, shortly after my divorce from Bob, my first husband. I met John as a blind date, and amazingly, we immediately clicked. He fell for me at first sight. It was a second marriage for both of us, and it took us a few months to get adjusted to each other. But we were so very much alike it was spooky, pardon the pun. He was living in a house on Erie Road, not too far from downtown Willoughby, Ohio. This particular house I was familiar with since I was a kid. The neighborhood kids and I used to ride our bicycles past that house on Erie Road in the summer months. Every time I looked at that house, I got the crawling scalp. I could just sense something wrong about it. My gaze was unusually drawn to the third floor upstairs window that I later discovered was an attic. I felt something up there to be looking back at me and letting me know, yes, I'm here, just keep riding on. I instinctively knew the house was haunted, not just because it was a decrepit, run-down dwelling over 100 years old, but because I just felt it. Many years later, I never imagined that I'd actually be living there with my second husband and his mother, Mary. Mary was divorced from Tom, her second husband, and needed somewhere to live. John and his sister, Jean, invited her to live with them. John and Jean are the ones who originally found the house and rented the upstairs portion. It was an old farmhouse that was converted into an up and downstairs apartments. However, when John and I got together, Jean had married and moved out. Mary was a wonderful mother-in-law, and on top of that, she was incredibly psychic. John was psychic, and I, likewise, was slightly psychic. Now, you get 3 psychic individuals in a haunted environment with an electrical power substation in a wooded area, not even 80 yards behind the house, and you're looking at paranormal disaster, as we later would find out. It started out innocent enough, with very little drawing our attention. We just shrugged those little things off. However, the more we settled into a home life routine, the more things began to get noticed. Incidents like apparitions, that is to say, solid objects disappearing into thin air and turning up in the most unlikely places. When you put a coffee pot on a stove, leave the room for a few seconds, go back, the pot is gone and cannot be found anywhere. A day later, said coffee pot turns up in the refrigerator. Give me a break. All sorts of items were going missing to be found hours or days later. We'd hear our names called with no one there, being touched with no one nearby, hearing sounds that cannot be accounted for, going away for a few hours and coming home to the kitchen floor having 2 inches of ice-cold water on it. No water was left running, there was no rain, and the roof didn't leak. We began to doubt our sanity until we realized that the house was, in fact, haunted. Mary, being Catholic, sprinkled holy water around, but it may as well have been chocolate syrup. In fact, things escalated to a fever pitch. Outbreaks of millions of baby spiders swarming all over the ceiling of John and my bedroom. Later, there was an outbreak of millions, no exaggerations, of millipedes, little wireworms crawling all over the inside and outside of the house, even spilling out into the front yard. Super nightmare. Another time I was alone in the living room, seated on the couch with the dog, Bumpy, at my feet, reading a book. Suddenly she rose, stared at the ceiling, began a low growling with all the hackles on her back raised, and trembling against my legs. From the far end of the house, directly over the kitchen, I heard up in the attic heavy footsteps. It sounded like a very large man with work boots on walking from that end to the living room right over my head. I even heard the boots squeal as they did a 180 and marched slowly back over the kitchen area. That was too much. I tore out of the living room, down the hall, through the kitchen, and into the imagined safety of the bathroom with the poor dog hot on my heels. Her and I just waited in the bathroom for John to come back home. He burst out of the bathroom and I excitedly told him what had transpired. He grabbed a bat and went up to the attic stairs. I followed him. Of course, there was no human intruder found. I knew that there wouldn't be either. In the attic directly behind the railing at the top of the stairs was a tremendous cold cubicle. It was about 5 feet wide and 8 feet deep. In the summer months, the temperature up there rose to almost 120 degrees. Yet in that one area behind the railing, it was like a meat locker. You could stick your arm in and feel the ice cold and see your breath. We deduced that the thing was concentrated in that area for the most part. However, it still had the ability to make us miserable. It began to affect our moods in the most negative ways. We'd fight for the most inconsequential things, leave the house and then wonder why we fought in the first place. It even drove John to drinking and charging up the steps to the attic to do battle with it. I managed to sober him up, calm him down, and rationalize with him. We made the decision to sell whatever we could to earn extra money in addition to our work paychecks and get out. If something doesn't want you there, you cannot reason with it. Just get out. When we found a nice mobile home in West Park, Cleveland, we loaded up the car with all our belongings and 2 dogs and left so fast that we left a vapor trail behind us. We never looked back. It took us the better part of a year living in the trailer, adjusting to relative normalcy, to stop jumping at our own shadows. This is no Amityville horror. This really happened. No one would live in the house too long after we left, and it was sold to a preacher that turned it into a church. Eesh. I hope the religious influence has made a dramatic difference, but we wouldn't even drive by that place anymore. To those of you that are skeptics, no amount of convincing will sway you. However, to those of you that are dealing with it or have dealt with something like this, I'm sure you more than understand. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.